The idea of Steamtown started when a group of steam lovers, such as myself, led by Nelson Blount, decided that something must be done to save what remained of the great steam engines which powered our railways, ran our boats, and operated our factories. Even in 1959, when the Steamtown idea gained headway, the railroads were well on their route to dieselization. We thought that our nation would be well served if a very large collection could be placed at one site, where great multitudes could ride the trains, watch the equipment, and learn something in the process. I felt in my own heart that Blount, the trustees, and I actually had a very powerful and inspiring message to tell. It was a message that was very clear, and one which the complexity and vastness of these huge iron monsters could make more emphatic. Blessed with this fine acreage beside the Connecticut River and flanked by the beautiful mountains of New Hampshire and Vermont, we are further charged with a responsibility to enhance this setting. We have an opportunity to create an attractive, pleasant, and natural enhancement to this lovely surrounding countryside. Nelson Blount and I talked for many hours about the things we would like to happen at the Riverside site. And while there might have been arguments on details, there never was question that Steamtown was to be the great monument to steam power. Edgar T. Mead, May 27, 1968.
At the opening of the second half of the 20th century, the steam locomotive had been the dominant symbol of railroading for nearly its entire history. Through its massive contributions to commerce, communication, and sociality, it had worked its way into the fabric of American culture and everyday life. Songs, writings, and films immortalized the steam locomotive and its smiling, waving engineer clad in denim. Children dreamt of being at the throttle and cherished the wave that seemed to affirm an understanding that they, too, may someday become engineers. But the steam locomotive in the United States was dead by 1960, aside from a few holdouts, mainly industrial operations. The introduction of the diesel locomotive, begun in earnest in the 1930s, had paved the way for American railroading's post-war rush to modernize. Diesels were cheaper to run, easier to clean and maintain, and more economical to operate. For the cash-strapped railroads who had been run into the ground during the Second World War, and who now faced increasing competition on the road and in the air, the diesel was the key to the future of railroading. With the passing of any era, an effort often emerges to try and pull some of it back out of the abyss, both to educate future generations and to satisfy the nostalgic longings of those not ready to part with what they knew and loved. As thousands of steam locomotives in the United States and Canada were lined up and scrapped by their respective railroads, enthusiasts in the private sector began to do all they could to prevent a mass extinction event. Some, like Walt Disney and his legendary staff of animators, successfully incorporated their zealous love of steam trains into their enterprises at places like Disney World. Across the nation, tourist steam excursion rides and small museums manifested on unwanted stretches of track, offering a dose of nostalgia to the old and new discoveries for the young. The steam locomotive was suddenly in vogue again. Among these wild and complicated chapters of early American steam preservation is the tale of F. Nelson Blount and his railroad enterprises. Blount is without a doubt one of the more fascinating individuals to ever emerge from the railroad enthusiast scene. He created a steam tourist railroad, the Monadnock, Steamtown, and Northern Amusement Corporation, and envisioned an accompanying museum on a grand scale never before seen, a cavalcade of steam power to educate those who would be doomed to miss out on that colorful era in railroading. Between 1960 and 1967, Blount attempted to find a permanent place to operate his tourist railroad, as well as room and support to establish his museum at several locations in New Hampshire and Vermont. Eventually that museum, Steamtown, U.S.A., settled in Rockingham, Vermont, where it remained until 1983, and its famous move to Scranton, Pennsylvania. Steamtown, what it was then, what it became, and what it is today, has a complex history shared by many people in different parts of the country. As such, its origins in New Hampshire and Vermont are often condensed, misunderstood, or, at worst, forgotten. Misconceptions like these are understandable due to the brief and complicated nature of these early tourist operations that were fraught with considerable and complex political discussion and negotiations. The regrettable result of these misconceptions, however, is that they cloud these colorful early days packed with rich details and absorbing characters, not often mentioned fully within the fabric of Steamtown. These were pioneers of the steam preservation and tourist railroad industries, a motley crew making things work often in the face of challenges, both mechanical and human. These operations provided a final vestige of steam power in an otherwise dieselized region, and afforded photographers an opportunity to capture activity at locations that would otherwise have been neglected and forgotten. These were the first tourist railroad operations on Boston and Maine railroad trackage, and some of the earliest in New Hampshire and New England as a whole. Most importantly, for those still living that worked and experienced them, the memory of these early operations adds to a shared historical narrative that still generates interest to this day, over half a century later. With Steamtown continuing down a drastically different path today as a National Historic Site in Scranton, Pennsylvania, these roots are vital to understanding its modern existence. This is a story of railroads, of great fire-breathing steam locomotives rescued, revived, and restored with loving care and great personal cost. But more importantly, this is a story of people, of railroaders and enthusiasts, of millionaires and politicians, of preachers and newspaper reporters. The physical connections to that world and that vibrant time have somewhat faded. But there are still those among us who made their mark not only on this story, but the historical quilt woven from its many strings. And so the New England roots of a modern-day National Historic Site in Pennsylvania have become partially buried in time, fully visible only at certain times and in certain amounts. This is a story not only of people, places, machines, and dreams, but also a rich time period. Threads onto which an understanding and appreciation of it truly begin.
We go now for the truth to find out how well our panelists, all five of them, did, as we learn now which one of these gentlemen actually is the one who is the creator of Steamtown, U.S.A. So will the real Nelson Blount please stand up?
Across the many avenues of the railroad community are countless names. Perhaps one of the most overarching and recognizable names in the modern history of American railroading is that of Francis Nelson Blount. Nelson, as he would be called, was born May 21st, 1918, in Warren, Rhode Island, to Willis and Ruth Blount. Growing up, Nelson and his elder sibling Luther aided their family at the ice company established by Willis in Barrington, Rhode Island in 1919. For Nelson, this tough work helped build determination and a strong work ethic. When he was not helping his father or going about the usual activities of a child, Nelson frequented the New Haven Railroad yard located near his home. An appreciation and interest in trains can come at any age, but as many will know, a true passion for everything railroading starts at a very young age. And for Nelson, this was it. When New Haven Railroad engineer Louis Gerald offered a cab ride, that sacred event that seals a lifelong appreciation of trains, Nelson was hooked. On May 23, 1933, just after his 15th birthday, Nelson played hooky to see the famous British steam locomotive, Royal Scot, on exhibition in Providence en route to the Chicago World's Fair. Here, a surprised Nelson happened upon schoolmate Frederick Richardson.
The Royal Scot came to America in May 1933, and by that time I'm pretty interested in railroads, and this was a much heralded event. So first time in my life I bunked school and went up there to Providence, and lo and behold, who's up there but Nelson Blount, unbeknownst to me. I knew who he was. We went to the same school. I was 2 years ahead of him in school. But what are you doing up here? Well, I'm interested in railroads. And so that began a lifelong friendship, and it started when the Royal Scot came to America.
Cue another formative moment in a young railroad enthusiast's life, meeting a peer who is just as nuts about trains as oneself. And thus was kindled a lifelong friendship. The two traded photographs, worked on models, argued over the superiority of local railroads. Nelson was a New Haven fan, and Fred liked the Boston and Maine. And even co-authored one of the first popular railfan books on the subject, Along the Iron Trail, in 1938. When Nelson purchased a Model A Ford Roadster in high school, the two went bombing around far and wide, visiting and photographing railroads. Their travels brought them to the rural stretches of the state of Maine, where in the 1930s the last 2-foot narrow-gauge railroads were finally shutting down. If anything speaks to the dedication of these two to steam railroading and its history, it would be these arduous treks from Rhode Island to Maine in a Model A Ford before interstate highways or even decent roads existed in most places. The superintendent of one of those Maine 2-footers, the Bridgeton and Harrison Railroad, was Edgar T. Meade, a gentleman who would someday play a large role in the Steamtown story itself. In an interview with Mark Morgan, historian for Steamtown National Historic Site on September 14, 1994, Meade recalled his first interactions with the two railfans.
Nelson Blount and his sidekick Fred Richardson came roaring into Bridgeton on motorcycles. One thing you have to know about Nelson Blount is that he never did anything halfway. It was all or nothing. It was absolutely a memorable event. I've never forgotten the presence of Nelson and Fred at this narrow-gauge terminal in Bridgeton, Maine. Edgar T. Meade.
The 1935 abandonment of another famous Maine 2-foot railroad, the Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes Railroad, and the boys' helplessness to stop it had such an emotional impact on the two that they began to discuss dreams of saving the memory of steam railroading. It was perhaps these experiences that did the most to plant the seed that would eventually sprout into Nelson's personal railroad collection, the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern Railroad, and Steamtown, U.S.A. It was also in these situations where Nelson's personality became clear to many. Going out of his way to meet and speak to as many people as possible, especially those in charge, his determination, persuasion, and strength of character spoke to the successes that lay ahead for him. Nelson continued through his high school years and into his 20s railfanning with Fred, working hard at his father's ice business, swimming, and attending school. A casual acquaintance with Ruth Palmer, whose mother had coincidentally been high school classmates with Nelson's parents, led to a friendship in 1938, and about a year later, courtship. After suffering a leg injury and a broken back when falling off a wharf while swimming, Nelson experienced a return return of his childhood undulant fever, and Blount was stuck recovering for the rest of 1939. When the United States' involvement in World War II took Fred off to the Coast Guard in 1942, Nelson attempted to enlist in the Navy, but was declared unfit due to his recent injuries. Nelson married Ruth soon after, and the two began a family, welcoming their first son in October 1943. Frederick Nelson Blount, named for Fred Richardson and nicknamed Teddy, was followed by his sister Carolyn in 1946, and later by brothers Bobby in 1948, Steve in 1952, and Billy in 1954. To provide for the growing family, Nelson began working with the United States Army, who furnished contracts to provide ice for the many camps and installations in Rhode Island and Cape Cod. Nelson's business acumen and fortune began in earnest when he began working with his uncle, Byron Blount, to supply clams to the Army as a supplement to the oyster industry, which had been ravaged by hurricanes in the 1930s. In 1943, Blount purchased the former Narragansett Oyster Company for $9,856, renaming it the Narragansett Bay Packing Company. A big break came in promoting the black quahog clam to the Army, which, after official testing, was approved, and demand exploded. Following the war, all of Nelson's seafood operations were reorganized as the Blount Seafood Corporation, with Nelson as president and treasurer, Uncle Byron as vice president, and Fred Richardson, back from the Coast Guard, serving as secretary.
Well, the Blount family had been in the oyster business since 1980, but the 38 hurricane wiped out the industry here at Narragansett Bay. But he was familiar with the oyster companies and so forth. So he said, well, I'll get back to you. So he found out, he went up to Salty Sea, found out he could buy oysters for X dollars a gallon. Mm-hmm. And then he adds 50 cents to it. And yep, we'll buy. So they were buying hundreds and hundreds of gallons every month, everyone at 50-cent markup. So pretty soon he's making $200 or $300 a week, which is big money then, you know. And that led to now he's back into the seafood business, and it led to other things because when it was seen that he was marketing seafood, that then other companies wanted to do business with him, and other government agencies as well. So that's how we made the transition from the ice business into the seafood business.
A lucrative partnership with Campbell Soup as a supplier of clams came not long after. The business, now Blount Fine Foods, is family-run to this day. By his 30th birthday in 1948, Nelson Blount was a millionaire. Nelson, who had come from a middle-class beginning, had worked his way to success. To help preserve the family's well-being from external social and business pressures, the Blounts moved to Dublin, New Hampshire in 1954. There they homesteaded in a Cape Cod-style Maine house built in the late 1700s, nestled in the shadow of Mount Monadnock on what later became known as Staghead Farm. Nelson had secured a comfortable future for his family, yet a void still existed within him. He was a man of many hobbies, enjoying flying, hunting, and outdoor sports. But the yearning of his railroad youth called, and he set out to preserve the iron horses which had been a formative part of his upbringing and identity. Much of the 2-foot narrow-gauge rolling stock that Nelson and Fred had experienced in the 1930s up in Maine had made its way to the cranberry bog country of southeastern Massachusetts. In 1947, Ellis D. Atwood, a distant cousin of Nelson Blount, had set up the Edaville Railroad, named for Ellis's initials, EDA. This was initially a cranberry hauling short line on Atwood's 1,800-acre cranberry plantation in South Carver, Massachusetts. In addition to hauling cranberries from the bogs to the screen houses, the little trains carried supplies in and out of the bogs as well. The operation also delighted visitors who could ride the trains free of charge, and by 1947, the Edaville Railroad was established as a tourist attraction. As such, Edaville was frequented by railroad enthusiasts, including Nelson Blount and Fred Richardson, throughout the late 1940s. Tragedy struck in 1950 when Ellis Atwood passed away from serious injuries suffered during the explosion of an oil burner in one of his screen houses. The railroad passed on to his widow Althea, and the operation continued under the direction of others until 1955, when Nelson Blount and Blount Seafood offered to purchase the Edaville Railroad. Although the locomotives and rolling stock were significantly smaller than the standard gauge equipment Nelson dreamt of operating, Edaville provided a launching point for his entry into the collection, operation, and display of vintage steam locomotives and railroad equipment. In addition to his railroading interests, Nelson's growing collection of vintage firearms and Americana, such as fire engines and industrial machinery, found a home in South Carver. The operation was by now no longer hauling cranberries or freight, but was extremely successful as a tourist attraction. Around this time, the Boston and Maine Railroad, one of New England's largest and most prominent, was completing its transition from steam to diesel power. Controversial President Patrick B. McGinnis served on the board of directors at Edaville and donated several pieces of equipment that were being retired at the Boston and Maine. These included, in 1956, a 260 Mogul-type steam locomotive, number 1455, and several wooden passenger coaches and combines. 1455 had been one of the very last steam locomotives to operate in revenue service on the Boston and Maine. 1455 was the first standard gauge steam locomotive acquired by Blount, and he was hooked. In the following years, Nelson and Fred traveled around North America and even overseas in search of forlorn retired steam locomotives languishing in scrap lines with uncertain futures. In an effort to prevent a repeat of the distressing fate they had seen on the narrow gauge lines in Maine, Nelson bought all he could with his own money, and by 1960 was in possession of nearly 40 steam locomotives, ranging from small industrial switchers to enormous passenger and freight locomotives. In 1957, McGinnis and the Boston and Maine donated their famous number 6000, better known as the Flying Yankee, a diesel-electric streamliner train that had just been retired after 22 years of service. On October 10th of that year, McGinnis wrote to Nelson informing him that he had issued instructions that our steam locomotive, number 3713, be earmarked for Edaville when it has served its purpose on the Boston and Maine. Unfortunately, Edaville was miles from the nearest standard gauge rail line, and trucking in number 1455, the coaches, and the Flying Yankee had been a headache. There had to be another solution.
And I know that the early years, 55, 56, when you first had the railroad,
yeah.
And that's when they were trying to bring in some standard gauge equipment. Was that the point when the idea of Steamtown was germinating, or was that just coincidental?
No, that was the idea of preserving locomotives. Mm-hmm. Steamtown wasn't thought of for some time afterwards.
Okay.
Because Nelson was acquiring locomotives faster than we could accommodate them.
Right.
And a lot of them came to Edaville. You know, the Godshaw engines. A lot of them were down there on display. And finally, then Nelson could see that he had to have some other place in it, because we were 6 miles from the nearest railhead.
That's right.
Yeah.
So it was tough to get the stuff in there.
Very tough.
Yeah.
Getting tougher because the transportation, over the highways, they didn't go for it. It was a lot of weight for some of the bridges.
Right.
So they were taking a dimmer view of it.
And so, Nelson set about in earnest to search for a new home to display and ultimately run his growing standard gauge steam locomotive collection. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, Nelson was able to display a major portion of his collection at the Pleasure Island Amusement Park, the so-called Disneyland of the Northeast, in Wakefield, Massachusetts. This park had been established by Bill Hawks, publisher and editor of Child Life magazine. Hawks wanted a working railroad at Pleasure Island as part of his vision for the attraction. Edgar Mead, the former superintendent of the Bridgeton and Harrison, who had met Nelson way back in the 1930s, was now a financial analyst and stockbroker, as well as an avid rail historian and author of several books. Mead introduced Hawks' idea to Nelson, who aided in establishing a narrow gauge steam operation at Pleasure Island using Edaville equipment. And so a deal was struck to display some of Nelson's standard gauge collection on exhibit at Engine City at Pleasure Island. In 1959, the Boston and Maine moved several pieces of Nelson's collection to the park, utilizing a spur built off of their nearby Newburyport branch, just north of Massachusetts Route 128. After being delivered, the locomotives and cars were towed and pushed into place with bulldozers. Yet before long, vandalism of Nelson's equipment at Pleasure Island, coupled with the clear financial instability of the park, and Nelson's desire to move ahead with his own plans, led to a decision to begin the search for a new home for his collection. By the late 1950s, Nelson Blount had been blessed in his life with a successful career, a loving and supportive family, a steadfast best friend, and a growing dedication to his hobbies. Now he could work towards his lifelong dream of saving and operating the steam locomotives that had ushered him into a lifelong appreciation for railroading. Momentum for Nelson's plans kicked off in the fall of 1960 with the announcement of Steamtown, U.S.A., a grand museum honoring the steam locomotive on a scale never before seen in the early years of the post-steam era. The first hint towards the proposed geographic location for this attraction came in December 1960. The village of North Walpole, New Hampshire, directly across the Connecticut River from the town of Rockingham, Vermont, and its village of Bellows Falls, was home to the Boston and Maine Railroad's Fitchburg Yard, a 10-acre plot of land at the end of their Cheshire branch up from South Ashburnham, Massachusetts. The Cheshire branch passed through the middle of a small railroad yard, complete with a 5-stall roundhouse with turntable, coal and sand towers, and plenty of room for repair and maintenance of Nelson's standard gauge equipment. Nelson was able to purchase the roundhouse and facilities from the Boston and Maine Railroad in late 1960, due in large part to his connections with the Boston and Maine and its president Patrick McGinnis that had been established earlier through Edaville. The location in North Walpole was admittedly smaller than Blount had envisioned for the museum, and expansion was limited by its geography, but the site was readily available and would allow a convenient place to kickstart operations. Blount and his associates went to work, and on December 7, 1960, Nelson met with businessmen from neighboring Bellows Falls to discuss the possibility of establishing Steamtown, U.S.A. at his newly acquired North Walpole site. He wanted to construct a large 450-foot by 65-foot structure to supplement the existing roundhouse where locomotives and exhibits could be displayed. As the new year arrived, Blount embarked on a goodwill campaign to promote the prospect of Steamtown, U.S.A. Local merchants were supportive and enthusiastic about the project. Public reaction to the new endeavor in Bellows Falls was mainly enthusiastic, as there was little existing economic draw in the area. Bellows Falls had been a railroad town for over a century, and with its Rutland Railroad on strike and in danger of total loss, another major source of the town's industrial economy was threatened. Residents wrote into local newspapers, voicing their support.
We hope to again see railroading at Bellows Falls as one of our major payrolls. Steamtown, USA is a golden goose for us. Let's not kill it.
The planned opening date for Steamtown, USA Cavalcade of Steam Power at North Walpole was anticipated to be as soon as August 1961. Across the river in the Granite State, however, North Walpole, New Hampshire was less welcoming to the prospect. They did not share the same general enthusiasm that Bellows Falls did, and the close proximity of many homes to the engine facility and Route 12 caused some fears of an increase in noise and traffic. Additionally, a planned expansion to Route 12 had the potential to slice through land that Blount needed for his museum. Construction possibilities at the North Walpole property were already limited by Fall Mountain to the immediate east and the Connecticut River just to the west. Fearing an interstate debate and boxed in by development, Blount quietly began to search for a better suited alternative location for Steamtown. The Steamtown project at North Walpole was discussed at a conference with the New Hampshire State Planning and Development Commission just over 2 weeks later on Wednesday, February 11, 1961. At the meeting, Blount put out feelers for the possibility of relocating Steamtown, USA elsewhere on the Cheshire branch, to a spot that might allow for the construction of museum facilities larger than he had available at North Walpole. Blount also hoped to involve the state of New Hampshire in the construction and possession of the museum. State assistance would certainly allow for a more substantial end result than could be provided through his personal financial means. H. Richard Preston, executive director of the commission, outlined the ways and means with which various state departments and agencies could assist with the establishment of Blount's project in Cheshire County. This was the first major indication of state interest and involvement with the development of Steamtown, U.S.A. When word spread about the meeting and the possibility of Steamtown opening not on the Vermont border, but deeper in New Hampshire, newspapers in the Green Mountain state began to question Blount's motives. The Brattleboro Reformer, on March 3, 1961, in an editorial titled "Steamtown Loses Steam," fired at the dud that was to be a tourist attraction, and the fanfare surrounding the allocation of local funds which might not be allocated at all if Steamtown was to open elsewhere. Defenders fired back. On March 10th, a certain Bellows Falls resident wrote to the paper pointing out that it was premature to say the project is destined to be a dud. Let's not judge it a failure yet. That individual was furloughed Rutland Railroad employee Robert W. Adams of Bellows Falls, soon to be the first full-time employee of the Monadnock Steamtown in Northern, and future president of the Green Mountain Railroad. Adams was not the only individual to lend clarification to Nelson Blount's motives. It seems that Blount himself reached out to the Brattleboro Reformer, who had published the Dud article. In a lengthy 2-hour talk, Nelson made clear his motivations and clarified what had been a lack of information on him and his plans. His offer was not a money-making plan, but purely to preserve for future generations the romance of steam. 2 days later, the Reformer issued another editorial, this time admitting its mistake for jumping the gambit and assuming on inadequate information.
What has convinced us is the magnitude of Mr. Blount's collection of famous steam locomotives, acquired at great personal expense, and the magnanimity of his offer to give them outright to the state of New Hampshire. If they can somehow be housed by the state near the Bellows Falls Keene Railroad line, he will operate, again at a loss, for the thousands of railroad buffs and all others interested in reliving a bit of the past when steam was king. The man's sincerity, his ability to produce, his willingness to give, and his obvious stature as a railroad historian and collector all add up to the need for a concerted effort by the communities and the state involved to try and find ways of bringing Steamtown, U.S.A. to this part of New England. Brattleboro Reformer, March 16, 1961.
Nelson's childhood friend and business associate Fred H. Richardson followed up with his own letter on March 29th.
It is a labor of love, Nelson jokes about his rail experiences when he states, "Never have I worked so hard to lose so much." But preserving the steam engines he loved in his youth is the gold. All else has become secondary. Frederick H. Richardson.
Support in Vermont was now solidified. But with the state of New Hampshire biting on the line as a contingency plan for Steamtown, U.S.A., focus quickly shifted from the immediate North Walpole area to Keene, New Hampshire. Keene seemed like a much more realistic option than the former, allowing for ample room as well as public and state support. Although the spotlight was no longer on the Rockingham area as a dedicated home for the museum, Keene was still very much within the geographic region, and locals were nevertheless enthusiastic. If Steamtown were to be built in Keene, the benefits to nearby Bellows Falls and North Walpole were still evident. Most automobile traffic would still need to pass through North Walpole and Bellows Falls, as Interstate 91, the closest major highway to Keene, would open as far as Rockingham in November 1963. Those arriving in the area via contemporary passenger rail on the Boston and Maine's Connecticut River Main Line would need to disembark at Bellows Falls, as that was the closest passenger stop to Keene, following the end of the Boston and Maine's own passenger rail in Keene in 1958. Local eateries, gas stations, and lodging would no doubt see benefit from Bellows Falls clear south to Brattleboro. Steamtown, U.S.A. at Keene could still be an economic win for eastern Vermont. Keene's mayor, Robert L. Mallett Jr., only 30 years of age, was a fervent supporter of the proposal, as was the Keene Chamber of Commerce, the Keene Regional Industrial Foundation, and the Monadnock Region Association. All believed that Keene was the perfect place for Blount's excursion operations and planned museum. As a quaint Yankee city with a rich history, and home to the so-called widest main street in the world, Keene would soon be named the All-American City, and was a large population center with beautiful scenery, especially in the autumn months. Letters of support bombarded New Hampshire Governor Wesley Powell from several prominent area individuals. Blount himself proclaimed in an editorial to the Keene Sentinel that, if Steamtown, U.S.A. is built in this area, Keene will be known in the future as the Memorial City of Steam. Children of the future will not be deprived of the enjoyment that we had in our youths of hearing, seeing, and riding behind these iron horses. Blount hurried to prepare excursion operations for 1961, hoping that the sights, sounds, and smells of steam trains operating from North Walpole down the Cheshire Branch towards Keene would provoke interest and stoke the fires of serious discussion with the state of New Hampshire on establishing a museum in the Keene area. The Monadnock Steamtown and Northern Amusements Incorporated was formed on Wednesday, April 26, 1961, as the operating entity for Nelson Blount's steam passenger excursions. In an operating capacity, it was to be referred to as the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern Railroad, or at other points simply as the Monadnock Northern. As fate would have it, operations over the Boston and Maine's Cheshire branch were subject to the agreement between the Boston and Maine and its labor unions. Any trains running over the Cheshire would require a unionized Boston and Maine crew instead of the non-union Monadnock Steamtown and Northern employees. Those details would have to be ironed out with the Boston and Maine over the next year, and thus a wrench was thrown into Nelson's plans. Meanwhile, spring had sprung, and the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern still needed a place to run its 1961 season. Its debut, not on the Cheshire branch, but 30 miles to the northeast along the sunny shores of Lake Sunapee, would be one of the most fascinating, strangest, and briefest chapters in its history.